Picture this: a quiet suburban neighborhood. The lawns are trimmed, children laugh in the streets, and neighbors wave politely as they pass one another. In one of these homes sits a man, ordinary, unremarkable, and invisible to history. He pays his taxes, coaches his child's soccer team, and holds down a respectable job. Yet under the right circumstances, under the pull of authority, under the intoxication of a crowd, or the slow drip of ideology, this very same man could become a monster. He could inflict suffering on strangers, betray friends, and even commit atrocities he once believed he was incapable of. It is here, in this unsettling contradiction, that the psychology of evil emerges. Not as something alien, not as something reserved for the deranged or sadistic, but as a possibility that lurks within the most ordinary of human beings. We like to believe that evil wears a mask, that it has horns or a serpent's tongue, that it is easy to spot. But history tells us otherwise. The perpetrators of history's darkest chapters were not always fanatics frothing with hatred. Many were clerks stamping papers, soldiers following orders, citizens swept along by the tide. Hannah Arendt famously called it the banality of evil, the terrifying truth that ordinary men and women can, without realizing it, become agents of destruction. And so the question echoes, why do good people do terrible things? Within us lives a paradox. We are capable of immense compassion, and yet we are also capable of cruelty that defies comprehension. The same hands that cradle an infant can tighten a noose. The same voice that sings lullabies can scream for blood. How can both exist within the same being? Is evil an external force? Something that tempts us, corrupts us, or invades us? Or is it an internal potential, a shadow that accompanies us from birth, waiting for the right conditions to emerge? Religions have long framed this as a battle between good and evil, angels and demons, God and the devil. But psychology and philosophy suggest something more haunting, that the capacity for evil is not foreign, but woven into the fabric of our humanity. If that is true, then every act of cruelty is not only a story about them, the monsters, the dictators, the criminals, but also a mirror reflecting back to us what we might become. Consider the soldiers at My Lai in Vietnam, or the prison guards at Abu Ghraib, or the participants in Stanley Milgram's shocking obedience experiments. These were not demons born in darkness. They were ordinary people, neighbors, brothers, sisters, co-workers. And yet, when placed in a system that normalized violence, when pressured by authority, or when given anonymity, they crossed lines they once thought uncrossable. They shocked strangers until screams went silent. They photographed themselves grinning beside tortured bodies. They marched innocents into graves. It is not enough to say they were evil while the rest of us are good. For if the difference is merely chance, circumstance, or pressure, then none of us are immune. This realization rattles the foundations of our moral certainty. It forces us to question the comforting narrative we tell ourselves, that evil is something out there, something alien, something we could never become. Think for a moment about conformity, the subtle but relentless pull to fit in, to align with the group. Think about obedience, the instinct to follow orders from authority, even when conscience resists. Think about dehumanization, the way language and ideology can reduce living beings into rats, vermin, or enemies. Each of these psychological forces is invisible in isolation, harmless perhaps when small, but together they form a cage. And once inside, ordinary people begin to act in ways they never imagined possible. Do we underestimate the fragility of our own morality? Are our virtues as permanent as we believe? Or are they merely conditional, dependent on comfort, safety, and the absence of pressure? What happens when the system itself rewards cruelty, when survival demands betrayal, when silence is the path of least resistance? The truth is uncomfortable, even terrifying. Evil is not a distant shadow. It is a possibility, one that flickers in the hearts of all of us. When we recoil at the atrocities of history, we must also confront a darker realization. Under the right conditions, we might have been among the perpetrators. This is not to excuse or diminish the suffering caused by cruelty. Rather, it is to pierce the illusion of separation, to expose the unsettling reality that the capacity for good and the capacity for evil are not divided across different people, but interwoven within each. And so, we return to the question that refuses to leave us. Why do good people do terrible things? The answer will not be simple, nor will it be comforting. To uncover it, we must descend into the roots of human psychology and philosophy, to examine the shadows that thinkers like Jung, Nietzsche, and Sartre have long warned us about. For only by confronting the origins of evil within ourselves and within society can we begin to understand its grip, and perhaps, just perhaps, learn how to break free. Evil has always been difficult to pin down. To some, it is an external enemy, to be fought with sword or prayer. To others, it is a flaw in human nature, an inescapable part of the human condition. But to truly grasp why good people do terrible things, we must turn inward and downward, into the depths of psychology, into the realm of philosophy, into the undercurrents that shape our behavior long before we are aware of them. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the dark counterpart to our conscious self. It is not merely the grotesque or criminal impulses that society condemns. It is also the hidden desires, fears, and instincts that we repress to maintain an image of who we think we are. The more fiercely we deny this shadow, the more power it gathers in the dark. And when circumstances align, when authority grants permission or chaos removes restraint, the shadow can erupt with terrifying force. What we believed buried deep within us is suddenly alive, embodied in our actions. Nietzsche warned of this same danger in another form. He declared, "Beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster." For Nietzsche, evil was not a distant other, but a mirror held uncomfortably close. The will to power, the fundamental drive he believed moved all life, can express itself as creation and vitality, or as domination and cruelty. When unchecked by self-awareness, when channeled into ideology or blind obedience, this will become destructive. Evil, then, is not a rare mutation of human nature, but the natural overflow of instincts we all carry, twisted by circumstance and unleashed without reflection. Schopenhauer, writing earlier, spoke of a darker force still, what he called the will, an insatiable blind striving at the root of existence. For him, suffering was inevitable, because the will could never be satisfied. When this ceaseless striving collided with human pride and desire, cruelty was born. Others became obstacles, pawns, or sacrifices to the endless hunger of one's own will. In this framing, evil is not an accident, but a natural consequence of the very force that drives us to live, reproduce, and conquer. To live at all is already to participate in a system where suffering is inflicted, whether intentionally or not. But existentialists like Sartre reframe the issue in terms of freedom. For Sartre, human beings are condemned to freedom, always responsible for their choices, even when we pretend otherwise. Evil in this sense arises when we deny this responsibility, when we hide behind roles, orders, or systems. The soldier who says, "I had no choice, I was just following orders," is in fact making a choice. The choice to surrender responsibility and conform. By refusing to face the weight of freedom, we allow structures to dictate our actions, and in doing so, we become agents of harm without ever claiming it as our own. This is not the fiery evil of myth, but the quiet surrender of our humanity. Aldous Huxley, peering into the 20th century, saw a different but related danger. Not evil through violence alone, but evil through dehumanization disguised as progress. In Brave New World, he warned of a society where pleasure, distraction, and conditioning dissolve individuality, turning humans into obedient parts of a machine. Here, evil is not the eruption of rage, but the slow erosion of meaning, where people harm one another not out of hatred, but indifference, where atrocities are committed not by tyrants alone, but by the countless hands of those who refuse to question. Even Viktor Frankl, surviving the horrors of Auschwitz, observed that suffering itself did not destroy people as much as the loss of meaning did. Evil in the camps was not only in the whips of guards, but in the way meaning was stripped away, in the way human beings were reduced to numbers, in the way dignity was systematically erased. For Frankl, the antidote to evil was not blind optimism, but the fierce reclaiming of meaning, even in the face of despair. Without meaning, the human soul collapses into cruelty or apathy. Taken together, these voices paint a grim yet clarifying picture. The shadow that Jung described is within us all, and denying it only strengthens its grip. Nietzsche's will to power courses through every human act, threatening to corrode into domination when unchecked. Schopenhauer's blind will ensures that suffering is the baseline condition of life, from which cruelty easily grows. Sartre reminds us that our greatest temptation is to flee from responsibility, to surrender our freedom to authority or custom. Huxley shows us how comfort and conformity can become their own forms of bondage. And Frankl reminds us that when meaning is stripped away, evil rushes in to fill the void. What emerges is not a simple answer, but a chilling recognition. Evil does not come from elsewhere. It arises from the same currents that give us life, drive us forward, and shape our societies. It is the shadow of our creativity, the underside of our freedom, the distortion of our will, the absence of our meaning. To understand evil is to admit that its roots are intertwined with everything we call human. And if that is true, then the question is no longer, why do some people do terrible things? But rather, what keeps any of us from doing them? If the origins of evil lie deep within human psychology and philosophy, then its impact is all the more insidious, because it is not confined to war zones, dictatorships, or moments of collapse. It seeps into daily life, shaping our thoughts, our choices, and our institutions. We imagine evil as extraordinary, as dramatic, as rare. Yet it works silently, invisibly, through the architecture of the mind and the structure of society. By the time we recognize it, we are already complicit. Neuroscience has shown us that the human brain is exquisitely vulnerable to fear, authority, and group identity. When we perceive a threat, the amygdala floods the body with urgency: fight, flight, or freeze. In such moments, moral reasoning collapses and instinct takes over. A neighbor who yesterday was a friend can, under the right fear, be recast as an enemy. A stranger can be stripped of humanity with a single label, terrorist, criminal, heretic. The brain, eager to simplify, accepts these shortcuts as truth. And once a human being is reduced to a category, harming them no longer feels like harming at all. This process is accelerated by cognitive biases, those invisible distortions in our thinking that guide us without our awareness. The authority bias makes us more likely to obey commands from someone in uniform or in power, even if the order violates our conscience. The in-group bias convinces us that those who belong to our tribe deserve empathy, while those outside it deserve suspicion or even punishment. The diffusion of responsibility allows us to commit cruelty in crowds we would never commit alone, each individual whispering to themselves, "It wasn't really me." These are not the mental quirks of sociopaths. They are the operating system of the human mind. The Stanford prison experiment, despite its methodological controversies, still illustrates this reality. When ordinary students were randomly assigned roles of guard and prisoner, they slipped with alarming speed into patterns of domination and submission. The uniforms, the setting, the collective belief in the experiment's rules, all of it worked like a spell. What shocked observers was not how a few bad individuals abused power, but how swiftly most participants conformed to roles that encouraged cruelty. It was not abnormality on display, but normality stripped bare. The same forces echo in history's atrocities. In Rwanda, decades of propaganda referring to Tutsis as cockroaches primed ordinary citizens to take up machetes against their neighbors. In Nazi Germany, bureaucrats behind desks stamped forms that condemned millions, rarely lifting a hand in direct violence, yet becoming essential gears in the machinery of genocide. In both cases, evil did not arrive with fanfare. It seeped in through words, symbols, rules, and habits until the unthinkable felt inevitable. But the impact is not limited to moments of collective horror. On a personal level, the same forces shape the way we betray loved ones, silence ourselves when conscience demands we speak, or participate in systems that exploit others for our own convenience. Consider the factory worker who senses the harm of the products they assemble, but tells themselves it is just a job. Consider the employee who watches a colleague harassed yet stays quiet to protect their career. Consider the countless ways we accept suffering so long as it is invisible or distant. Sweatshops overseas, prisons overflowing at home, children mining the minerals that power our devices. Evil here is not dramatic, but banal, braided into the fabric of everyday life. And yet, this banality is precisely what makes it terrifying. If evil were rare, if it were confined to dictators and serial killers, we could rest easy. But if it is systemic, if it thrives in bureaucracy, in silence, in the convenience of not asking questions, then we must confront a darker reality. Evil is the default state when conscience falls asleep. The ordinary world is fertile soil for extraordinary harm. Psychologically, this realization is suffocating. It suggests that none of us are innocent, not entirely. We live in societies that require exploitation somewhere down the chain, and we benefit from structures built on domination, conquest, and inequality. The food we eat, the clothes we wear, the technologies we treasure, all are stained with invisible costs. To see this clearly is to feel trapped, complicit, implicated. The question is no longer, how could they do such things? But how are we doing them now? There is also the cultural conditioning of violence itself, the way societies glorify war, competition, and domination. From the toys given to children to the stories that fill screens, We are trained to see power as virtue and submission as weakness. Heroism is defined as destroying the enemy, not understanding them. Success is measured in conquest, not compassion. In this sense, evil is not just tolerated, it is celebrated, rebranded as strength, efficiency, or justice. And so the cycle continues, not because we love cruelty, but because we mistake it for something noble. The impact of all this is cumulative. Neuroscience shows us that repeated exposure to cruelty, even indirectly, numbs empathy. Soldiers in combat zones, guards in prisons, even citizens scrolling past endless images of suffering online, all gradually experience what psychologists call compassion fatigue. The more suffering we witness without acting, the easier it becomes to justify inaction, and the more natural cruelty appears. This is the psychological trap. Evil does not overwhelm us in one dramatic blow, but erodes us slowly until we no longer recognize how far we've drifted. And so we arrive at a realization both unsettling and urgent. Evil is not extraordinary at all. It is ordinary. It hides in compliance, in habit, in silence, in the refusal to see. It spreads not because monsters seize power, but because ordinary people fail to resist when the currents of fear, authority, and conformity sweep them along. Its impact is not only on the victims of violence, but on all of us, corroding our sense of responsibility, numbing our capacity for empathy, and training us to look away. But if this is true, if evil is embedded in the machinery of society and the architecture of the mind, how do we resist it? How do we awaken conscience against the tide of conformity? How do we reclaim our freedom when the temptation to surrender it is so strong? To move forward, we must explore a new perspective, not the comforting illusion that we are immune, but the disruptive recognition that resistance begins with awareness, with responsibility, with a radical reimagining of what it means to be human. If evil thrives in the cracks of obedience and the comfort of conformity, then the first act of resistance must be awakening. But awakening is never easy. It requires the courage to look directly at the shadow we would rather ignore, the one within us, the one within our culture, the one hidden in the ordinary structures of daily life. For centuries, most people have preferred the ease of blindness, telling themselves that the burden of conscience belongs to others. Yet history whispers that liberation begins only when individuals refuse to surrender to the machinery of silence. The philosopher who saw this most clearly was Jung. His notion of the shadow was not meant to condemn humanity, but to liberate it. To confront the darkness within is not to celebrate it, nor to collapse in guilt, but to integrate it, to recognize that the same instincts that give rise to cruelty also hold the potential for strength, creativity, and courage. A person who denies their anger may one day unleash it destructively. A person who admits it, understands it, and channels it may transform that energy into justice. To break free, we must first make peace with the fact that the line between good and evil does not run between nations, classes, or religions, but through the heart of every human being. Nietzsche, too, warned of the danger of suppressing our instincts only to see them explode in distorted forms. His remedy was not blind restraint, but transformation, the sublimation of raw impulses into higher expressions. The will to power need not manifest as domination. It can also become art, innovation, or the pursuit of truth. What distinguishes destruction from creation is not the absence of instinct, but the clarity of its direction. To live consciously is to wrestle constantly with this force, to guide it toward vitality rather than tyranny. But awareness alone is not enough. History shows us that evil is often sustained not only by individuals, but by systems, structures that normalize cruelty and reward compliance. Breaking free, then, requires more than private virtue. It demands collective disobedience. Consider the acts of resistance during the Holocaust. The villagers of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in France who quietly sheltered thousands of Jews. The Danish citizens who ferried their neighbors to safety across the sea. The small groups of individuals who, though powerless in the grand scheme, chose to act as if their decisions still mattered. In each case, the force of conformity was countered by a different kind of conformity, not obedience to cruelty, but a shared commitment to human dignity. This pattern repeats across cultures. Gandhi's Satyagraha, the insistence on truth through nonviolent resistance, transformed a people's despair into power. Martin Luther King Jr., inspired by Gandhi, reframed struggle as a moral theater where the exposure of injustice could awaken the conscience of the oppressor. These leaders did not deny the existence of evil. They exposed it, resisted it, and revealed that the human spirit, when anchored in meaning and courage, can fracture the seemingly unbreakable machinery of oppression. Yet the call is not only to monumental acts of protest. Breaking free can begin in the smallest decisions. The refusal to laugh at a cruel joke, the courage to speak when silence would be easier, the discipline of examining our own biases before condemning the sins of others. Sartre was right. Freedom is inescapable, even when we deny it. Every moment we choose. To pretend otherwise is to hand our agency to systems that will gladly shape our choices for us. To recognize it is to reclaim the terrifying but exhilarating responsibility of being human. In modern culture, this awakening requires vigilance against more subtle chains. As Huxley warned, evil need not come in the form of violence. It may arrive disguised as pleasure, comfort, and distraction. The most effective tyranny is not the one that terrifies us, but the one that seduces us. To break free, we must not only resist fear, but also the narcotic of entertainment that numbs our conscience. To unplug, to sit in silence, to seek meaning beyond distraction. These acts are small revolutions in a world designed to keep us asleep. But perhaps the most radical perspective comes from Viktor Frankl's insight. That meaning is the final defense against evil. A person who discovers purpose, even in suffering, becomes unbreakable in spirit. In Auschwitz, he observed that those who could find meaning, however fragile, were more likely to survive, not only physically, but morally. They resisted despair, clung to dignity, and refused to let cruelty define their inner world. Evil seeks to strip us of meaning. Resistance is the refusal to surrender it. In our own lives, meaning may not be tested in the extremity of a camp, but it is tested every day, in how we treat others, in how we pursue our work, in how we face suffering. What then is the new perspective? It is the recognition that evil is not inevitable. It is the choice to confront the shadow instead of denying it, to transform instinct instead of repressing it, to resist conformity instead of surrendering to it, and to build meaning even where despair threatens to erase it. It is to remember that every structure of cruelty has been sustained by the silence of many and broken by the courage of a few. And so the burden falls on us, not as passive observers of history, but as active participants in its writing. To break free is to take the weight of freedom seriously, to live as if our smallest choices matter because they do. In every moment, We tip the scale slightly, toward dignity or toward destruction. Evil thrives when we tell ourselves the scale is too vast for us to influence. But the truth is that the scale is nothing but the accumulation of countless small choices made by countless ordinary people. The paradox, then, is shattered. Good people do terrible things not because they are inherently doomed, but because they forget that their choices matter. To awaken is to remember. To resist is to live. To break free is not to destroy the shadow, but to face it, integrate it, and refuse to let it rule us. And when enough individuals do this, the machinery of evil falters, for it cannot function without our hands to keep it running. What if the deepest mistake we have made is thinking of evil as something foreign? We cast it outward, imagine it as an intruder, a curse, a force that infects only the unlucky or the corrupt. But the ultimate revelation is far more unsettling. Evil is not outside of us. It is the underside of our freedom, the shadow of our will, the echo of our silence. It is not a separate category of human existence, but the potential written into every human soul. And that means the battle is not against an alien force, it is against ourselves. This realization does not absolve us. It condemns us to vigilance. For if evil is always possible, then morality is not something we possess. It is something we practice. It is not a static identity, but a choice made again and again in moments so small they pass unnoticed. The temptation is to look at history's horrors and say, "That could never be me." But the truer, more dangerous statement is, "That could have been me, and therefore I must remain awake." The revelation is not comfortable, but it is necessary, because if good and evil are woven together in us, then every day is a test of which thread we will follow. The poets and philosophers have whispered this all along. Dostoevsky wrote that nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than to understand him. To understand him is to see that he is not a monster from another species, but a mirror of ourselves. Jung insisted that only by confronting our shadow can we avoid being ruled by it. Nietzsche warned us that in battling monsters, we risk becoming what we hate. Frankl reminded us that even in the most unimaginable darkness, the one freedom that cannot be taken is the freedom to choose our response. These voices converge to deliver a single haunting truth. The line between good and evil does not divide the world neatly. It runs through every beating heart. And yet, this revelation, though unsettling, is not despair. It is possibility. If evil is not inevitable, if it emerges from our choices, then the same power that makes cruelty possible also makes compassion possible. The same instincts that drive domination can drive creation. The same shadow that terrifies us can, when faced honestly, become the source of our strength. Evil reveals not just the fragility of humanity, but the depth of its potential. For in the very recognition of our danger lies the seed of our redemption. Imagine a society that takes this seriously, one where education is not merely about skills, but about self-awareness, about teaching every child to face the shadow within them before it is unleashed unconsciously. Imagine institutions that reward not blind obedience, but moral courage, that honor the dissenter as much as the conformist. Imagine cultures that resist the narcotic of distraction and instead insist on meaning, on the quiet but radical act of being fully awake. Such a world would not abolish evil, but it would strip it of its invisibility. It would make resistance the norm rather than the exception. The task is not small. To live with this awareness is to accept the burden of freedom with all its weight. It means rejecting the comfort of saying, "It wasn't my choice." It means looking at the small cruelties we tolerate, the silences we excuse, the shadows we deny, and refusing them. It means remembering that morality is fragile, that empathy must be protected, that freedom without responsibility is a breeding ground for destruction. It means living as if every decision carries significance, because it does. And so the ultimate revelation is paradoxical. We are both the danger and the hope. We are the ones who create the machinery of evil, and we are the only ones who can dismantle it. We are capable of unspeakable cruelty, and we are capable of extraordinary compassion. The deciding factor is not fate, not destiny, not some cosmic sorting of the good from the wicked. It is choice, messy, daily, unglamorous choice. The battlefield of good and evil is not history's great stage, but the quiet moment when you decide to speak or stay silent, to see or to look away, to act or to surrender. In this light, the psychology of evil is not a study of monsters. It is a study of us, of you, of me, of what it means to be human. We cannot escape this knowledge now. We cannot retreat to the safety of believing that evil belongs only to others. The mirror is too clear. The shadow is too close. So the question remains, but now sharpened to a blade. Why do good people do terrible things? Because they forget who they are. Because they forget that freedom is responsibility. Because they choose the comfort of blindness over the pain of awareness. And yet, the reverse is also true. Good people resist terrible things when they remember, when they see, when they accept the unbearable weight of freedom and act anyway. The closing is not a resolution, but a challenge. To recognize that the abyss is always with us. To live knowing that every step we take is toward light or toward darkness. To refuse the luxury of believing the choice is someone else's. The psychology of evil is the psychology of being human. And to understand it is to stand at a crossroads that never disappears. A crossroads we meet again and again, every day, in every decision. What then will you choose?